Welcome to the Insight Meditation community of Charlotte. I'm Ward Simmons. I'm one of 6 Dharma leaders that rotate responsibility for leading on Wednesday nights. Welcome to those of you on Zoom. I'm going to make a request of you Zoomers. If there's a reason you need to keep your video off, then of course you should keep it off. If there's not a reason, it's useful for me as a speaker to be able to see who's out there. So that's a request. So tonight I want to speak about a really basic but a very important element of practice. And that is something that I commented on in the guiding in, whether we're utilizing an inner or an outer focus when we're practicing. In her book, Pure and Simple, which is a book I've been enjoying quite a lot lately, Upasaka Key repeatedly references this element of practice. And this emphasis on inner versus outer focus is not unique to her teachings. It's reflected in numerous ways in the Dharma. This evening, I'd like to look at this inner versus outer focus from a number of different perspectives. But before we begin, I want to digress and just talk about why we might want to look at a teaching from different perspectives. So there is a sutta in which the Buddha and his followers were staying near a village, and there were many other practitioners, many contemplatives in the village, not the Buddha's followers, but other renunciates. And they all thought they had the right understanding, and they were all arguing. They were constantly arguing. No, I'm right. This is the understanding. That's no. And the sutta goes through all the different understandings. So the Buddha's monks went on alms rounds, and they came back and they asked the Buddha, they said, we don't know what to do. This is inappropriate for these spiritual seekers to be behaving this way. And the Buddha responded by reciting a story of a king who asked his minister to assemble everyone in the kingdom who had been blind since birth. And once they were all assembled, the king instructed that they were to be shown an elephant. And some were shown the elephant's head, some the ear, some the trunk or the foot or the tail, and so on. And then the king went to each of them and he said, "What is an elephant like?" So as you can imagine, each person described the elephant very differently. And as they heard each other describing the elephant, they began to quarrel and fight among themselves and say, "No, that's not what an elephant's like at all." The point the Buddha was making is that things look different to us depending on our perspective. And because of that, we should be careful not to presume that any one perspective is the correct one and to dismiss others. By being open to seeing things from a variety of perspectives, we gain a more complete understanding and we develop a clearer and more accurate view. So, returning to the teachings of Upasaka Key as one of our perspectives, she described the difference between an inner and an outer orientation this way. The basic challenge in the practice is this one point and nothing else: how to look inward so that you see clear through. If the mind hasn't been trained to look inward, it tends to look outward. simply waiting to receive its objects from outside. And all it gets is the confusion of its sensations going in and out, in and out. So let me just pause there and make a couple comments. When she says, all it gets is the confusion of its sensations, what she's talking about is sensory input from the six senses. And if we're not looking inward, if we're just surrendering ourselves to whatever stray experiences cross our paths, then the six senses control where our attention is. But if we train ourselves to look inward, then we are making a choice as to what we do with our attention. So meditation is often referred to as mind training. And when Upasaka Key says, when the mind hasn't been trained to look inward, it tends to look outward, she's saying that the practice of meditation, this mind training with which we are all engaged, is about redirecting our attention from the outer to the inner. The revered Thai monk and Dharma teacher Ajahn Chah said, if you want to understand your mind, sit down and observe it. He was encouraging us to adopt an inner focus, and that is our task. Now, we don't have to look very far to verify this. As you meditate, observe the nature of the thoughts that arise. Are they about inner or outer matters? And this might be the most important thing I say tonight in this talk. Make it a practice to categorize your thoughts in this way. Most people find that the vast majority of arising thoughts are about outer matters. And as you see this, simply abandon attending to that outer matter and open to what might be an inner component to what that thought was about. So I'll offer an example here. Lucy, one of our dogs, who I dearly love, has become more and more inclined over the years to bark loudly. And when I was meditating yesterday morning, the person who cleans the hallway outside our condo was vacuuming like they do every Tuesday morning. And you can imagine what happened. And I was aware of the unpleasantness of this loud barking. But eventually I identified it as being related to an outer set of circumstances. Not instantly, but eventually. And when I realized that my attention was outer focused, I was able to shift that attention to what internal circumstances might be present. Why am I so averse to loud barking? What underlying delusion do I labor under whereby I presume that I am entitled to a life without any loud noises? Gail and I made the choice to have dogs live in our household. What did I expect? My unpleasant experience can only be skillfully addressed if I explore my inner experience, not the outer. So let's look at inner versus outer from another perspective. If you've ever heard me give any talks, you've probably heard me refer to the distinction between our circumstances and our relationship to our circumstances. Now, I don't remember where I first heard this teaching, but it's not original with me. I believe it's just another way of making the distinction between inner versus outer focus. Some people can exist in devastating circumstances and still maintain a sense of equanimity. Nelson Mandela was able to spend 27 years in prison, and upon his release, he was able to invite his captors to join him in forming a new government. Then there are other people who can't seem to be at ease even when their conditions are quite favorable. Think of uber-rich people, some of whom suffer from depression and addiction and even self-destructive behaviors. Clearly, there's something at play beyond one's circumstances, and that something is our relationship to the circumstances. So our circumstances are the outer, and our relationship to them is the inner. When we turn our attention from our circumstances to our relationship with them, the prospects for positive change improve dramatically. If I live in Gaza or Ukraine, there is very little I can do to change my circumstances. But with proper mind training, my relationship to my circumstances is within my control. I can reduce or eliminate my mental stress and suffering right where I am, and it doesn't require any international aid or functioning water and electric service or access to the internet or money to purchase goods and services. Now, let me acknowledge that when I say this, I take a risk sitting here as I do, living a life of safety, and stating that those in dire circumstances simply need to change their perspective. My home has not been destroyed. My loved ones have not been injured or killed. My sources of food and water, medicine have not been disrupted. So it's not my intention to minimize the plight of those in desperate circumstances. In addition to the wisdom teachings, the Dharma also places great value on the heart teachings, including compassion for those suffering. And there are few circumstances that merit our compassion more than the situations in Gaza and Ukraine. Still, the truth of this teaching on inner versus outer orientation remains. The importance of working with what we can control, the inner, rather than exhausting ourselves, obsessing over what we can't control, the outer. So we can gain yet another perspective from another sutta that speaks to this rather eloquently. This is often referred to as the teaching on the second dart, and it correlates our outer experience with the first dart and our inner experience with the second dart. So keep that correlation in mind, and I'm going to read a short excerpt from this sutta. When an untaught worldling, so an untaught worldling is somebody who is not on the path, and he's getting ready to contrast that with the well-taught disciple. That's me and you. That's people who are pursuing this path. When an untaught worldling is touched by a painful bodily feeling, she worries and grieves. She laments, beats her breast, weeps, and is distraught. She thus experiences two kinds of feelings, a bodily and a mental feeling. It is as if a woman were pierced by a dart and, following the first piercing, she is hit by a second dart. But in the case of a well-taught disciple, when she is touched by a painful feeling, she will not worry, nor grieve and lament. She will not beat her breast and weep, nor will she be distraught. It is one kind of feeling she experiences, a bodily one, but not a mental feeling. It is as if a woman were pierced by a dart, but was not hit by a second dart following the first one. Think about someone who receives unwelcome medical news. The medical facts are the first dart. We can't stop the first dart from hitting us. We abide in human bodies that are subject to illness, old age, and death. Even a well cared for body will eventually fail us. These outer circumstances are not within our control. What we do control is our relationship to our circumstances, our inner experience relative to the outer circumstances. Without the mind training of meditation, the mind can easily spin off into stories of terrible outcomes. Maybe we worry that we can no longer work and we'll lose our home. Maybe we worry that we won't be able to pay the medical bills. Maybe we worry that we will be less desirable to others if we have physical damage or limitations. When we abide with a well-trained mind, we aren't subject to the second dart, the mental suffering that is the optional companion to the physical suffering. So yet another perspective on this inner and outer experience comes from Rodney Smith. Rodney is the founding teacher of the Seattle Insight Meditation Society, and he used to teach at Southern Dharma Retreat Center, northwest of Asheville. And for many years, I attended his annual retreats. On one occasion, when he was discussing reactivity, how we can become reactive to others, he made the statement, "It is never about the other person." It is never about the other person. And I didn't like hearing him say it, and I didn't believe it was true. And so for the rest of the retreat, my mind was filled with mental arguments with Rodney about how wrong he was. I would say, well, sometimes it's about the other person. If their actions are wrong, how can he not see that? So looking back, what I would say now is his statement was true and is true. But I didn't have the understanding to recognize that. The truth of the statement has nothing to do with whether the other person's actions are right or wrong. Maybe I believe the recent aggressive actions by federal military and law enforcement officials in our nation's cities are morally wrong. Or maybe I believe those actions are a justified use of force in response to desperate circumstances. Either way, those actions are outer. For my own well-being, what matters is my inner relationship with those outer circumstances. It is always about my relationship with the outer circumstances. Again, quoting Rodney Smith, we must decide if we want to be right or if we want to be free. Freedom comes from cultivating a skillful relationship with our inner experience. One more perspective to look at this inner-outer distinction. The Buddha did not have a corner on the market for wisdom. In fact, he described his discovery of the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path not as something that was original to him, but as a rediscovery of an existing path that others had followed before him. Many traditions share an understanding of some of the universal truths, and the truth of inner versus outer experience is one of those. So another perspective comes from Alcoholics Anonymous. where we encounter the serenity prayer. Many of y'all are familiar with that. It is one seeking the serenity to accept things I cannot change. That's an inner focus. The courage to change the things I can. That's an outer focus. And the wisdom to know the difference, which is definitely an inner focus. So here, the acceptance of things we can't change and the wisdom to know the difference. The inner focus, let's just pause for a moment and look at the outer focus. So sometimes Dharma teachings on practicing acceptance, the inner focus, sometimes those teachings are misunderstood as saying that we should sit passively by and do nothing to try to right wrongs that exist. But that's not correct. Nothing could be further from the truth. The Noble Eightfold Path includes the factors of wise view, wise intention, and wise effort. We develop wise view so that we know what is wholesome. And then we clarify our intention so that we are operating from skillful motives. And then we apply wise effort to implement what we understand to be a correct response to injustice. It is completely aligned with the Dharma to try to bring about wholesome change in our world, to seek to influence outer conditions. The practice of acceptance comes into play when we have done all that we can, yet unfavorable circumstances persist. That is when the inner work is the correct response. So to review, the teaching on utilizing an inner versus an outer focus is an essential tool in our meditation practice. It appears in many places in the Dharma, and it appears in teachings outside the Dharma. It is the tool we can use to apply all of the other teachings you hear about here in our Sangha. These include the Four Noble Truths, the 5 hindrances to meditation, the 5 aggregates of clinging, the 7 awakening factors, the 3 characteristics of existence, the 3 defilements, and so many more. Understanding and integrating these teachings into our lives requires that we cultivate an inner focus in our practice. We're not using our time to think about what somebody said to us today. We're reflecting on things that can advance our understanding. I invite you to develop the practice of classifying your arising thoughts during meditation as either inner or outer oriented. And when you identify an outer oriented thought, just drop it and turn your attention inward. That's where the opportunity for progress on the path resides. Over time, as this habit takes root, your attention will naturally remain focused inward, and you will be less disturbed by what occurs around you. This represents movement toward equanimity, toward insight, which is the fruit of the path. I'll close with a quote, one more quote from Upasaka Ki. We train the mind to be mindful and firmly centered and to focus on looking within. Don't let it get distracted outside. When it focuses within, it will come to know the truth of stress and the causes of stress, which are defilement, craving, and attachment, as they arise. It will see what they're like and how to probe inward to disband them. So I offer that for your consideration.